March 21st, 1945, the morning sun had barely crested over the flat Texas horizon when the transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Fannin near Tyler, carrying their unusual cargo. Inside sat 47 German women, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, the profound shock of capture. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, though they wore the tattered remnants of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. They were Nachrichtenfelfen communications helpers women who had operated radio equipment and telephone switchboards for the German military until Soviet forces overran their positions in East Prussia just weeks earlier. The women had endured a journey that defied imagination. First came the desperate westward flight from the advancing Red Army, then capture by American forces near the Elbe River, followed by interrogation centers in France, and finally the long Atlantic crossing aboard a Liberty ship. Now, on Texas soil, they descended from the trucks with trembling legs, many struggling to stand after the cramped journey from the port in Galveston. Their faces bore the universal expression of defeated combatants throughout history, a mixture of relief at surviving and terror of what came next. Lieutenant Colonel James Henderson, the camp commander, watched from his office window as the women were processed. A veteran of the North African campaign, Henderson had overseen thousands of male German posts during his tenure, but this group presented an unprecedented challenge. The Geneva Convention was clear about the treatment of prisoners, yet these women represented a category his training had never fully addressed. His orders from the War Department were equally clear: treat them with the same standards as male prisoners, ensure their security, and prepare them for eventual repatriation whenever the war in Europe concluded. Among the arriving prisoners was Marguerite Hoffmann, a 23-year-old from Hamburg whose husband served somewhere on the collapsing Eastern Front if he still lived. She clutched a small leather satchel containing her only possessions, a photograph of her wedding day, a Protestant prayer book, and a letter from her mother dated December 1944, before the firebombing had reduced their neighborhood to ash. Marguerite had volunteered for auxiliary service in 1943, driven by patriotic fervor and the promise of decent rations. Now, standing on enemy soil thousands of miles from home, that fervor had calcified into something harder, the survival instinct of someone who had watched too many friends die in the frozen chaos of retreat. The processing building smelled of disinfectant and institutional cooking, an odor simultaneously foreign and strangely comforting in its ordinariness. American WAC officers conducted the intake with professional efficiency, checking names against manifests, conducting medical screenings, and confiscating anything that might pose security risks. One by one, the women surrendered their few remaining possessions, received prisoner numbers, and were assigned to barracks in a specially designated section of the sprawling camp. The late March afternoon stretched long and uncertain before them, filled with whispered speculations in German about what their captivity might hold. As evening approached, the women settled into their new quarters with the resigned wariness of soldiers who had learned that survival meant adapting quickly to whatever circumstances presented themselves. The first 3 days at Camp Fannin passed in a fog of disorientation and cautious observation. The German women found themselves housed in wooden barracks that, while austere, exceeded anything they had experienced during the final months of the war. Each woman received a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and basic toiletries luxuries compared to the conditions they had endured while retreating through the devastated German countryside. Yet abundance bred suspicion rather than gratitude. Many believed this comfort represented a calculated psychological tactic, a softening before interrogation or worse. Sergeant Dorothy Vaughn, one of the American Wehrpersonal assigned to oversee the female posts, noticed the prisoners' wariness immediately. According to records maintained by the National Archives, correspondence between Camp Fannin administrators and the War Department during this period reveals the challenges of managing enemy women prisoners. A letter dated March 24, 1945, notes the distinct cultural and psychological differences requiring adjustment in standard procedures. Vaughn, a former schoolteacher from Illinois, approached her assignment with pragmatic compassion, recognizing that fear transcended national boundaries. They watched us like we were predators circling, Vaughn would later recall in an oral history interview conducted in 1983. Every gesture, every word had weight. They expected cruelty because that's what they'd been conditioned to believe about Americans. The daily routine began establishing itself. Morning roll call at 6:30, followed by breakfast in a separate mess hall reserved for the female prisoners. The meals consisted of standard Army rations: oatmeal, bread, occasional fruit, adequate nutrition, but deliberately bland. Exercise periods in a fenced yard, supervised closely. Afternoon work assignments doing laundry and mending for the male POW population housed elsewhere in the camp. Evening roll call, then return to barracks. The rhythm was predictable, institutional, and fundamentally non-threatening, yet the women remained guarded. Marguerite Hoffman emerged as an informal leader among the prisoners, her education and composure earning respect from both captors and fellow captives. She had studied English literature at university before the war, giving her rudimentary language skills that proved invaluable. Through halting conversations with Sergeant Vaughn, Marguerite began piecing together their situation. The war in Europe was nearly finished, Germany faced total defeat, and these American captors genuinely intended to follow the Geneva Convention standards. This last point seemed almost fantastical to women who had witnessed the collapse of all civilized norms during the war's brutal final phase. The psychological weight of uncertainty proved heavier than physical privation. What fate awaited Germany? Were their families alive? Would they face war crimes tribunals? The Nazi propaganda they had absorbed portrayed Americans as savage occupiers bent on vengeance. Yet the reality they experienced, brusque but fundamentally humane treatment, created cognitive dissonance that manifested in whispered debates during evening hours. Some women clung to increasingly desperate hopes that the Reich might somehow survive. Others, like Marguerite, began the painful process of accepting that everything they had believed and fought for had been built on lies. As the fourth day dawned, Lieutenant Colonel Henderson made a decision that would unexpectedly become a turning point in the prisoners' psychological adjustment to captivity. April 1st, 1945 Easter Sunday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that turned the Texas landscape into a riot of wildflowers. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson had spent the previous evening reviewing reports and wrestling with a decision that might seem trivial against the backdrop of global war but carried unexpected significance. The male German posts at Camp Fannin would receive a special Easter breakfast, as permitted under Geneva Convention provisions. Why not extend the same to the women? His administrative officer, Captain Robert Walsh, raised practical concerns. "Sir, we're still establishing baseline protocols for the female prisoners. A sudden change in routine might cause complications, raise expectations we can't sustain long-term." Henderson understood the logic but overruled it. "These women have been through hell, Walsh. It's Easter. We're going to feed them a proper breakfast, same as we'd feed our own people on a holiday." The decision reflected Henderson's personal philosophy, shaped by his Methodist upbringing in rural Oklahoma, that human dignity remained paramount even in wartime. He ordered the mess staff to prepare a full breakfast: bacon, scrambled eggs, toast, real butter, fresh milk for Easter morning. The female prisoners knew nothing of this decision as they assembled for morning roll call under a sky painted in pastels by the rising sun. The routine proceeded as expected: names called, responses given, the mechanical process of accounting for human inventory. Then came the unexpected announcement, translated by Sergeant Vaughn. "Today being Easter Sunday, you will receive a special breakfast. Please proceed to the mess hall." Suspicion rippled through the formation. Special meant different, and different had rarely meant good in their recent experience. Marguerite Hoffman exchanged glances with Frieda Schaefer, a 31-year-old widow from Berlin whose cynicism had been forged in the ruins of that devastated city. "Propaganda," Frieda muttered. "Americans will photograph us eating well, show the world how humanely they treat prisoners while our people starve." The mess hall bore no obvious signs of theater, no cameras, no assembled officers, no indication this breakfast served any purpose beyond nourishment. The prisoners filed to their tables, institutional discipline overriding uncertainty. Then the kitchen staff began serving, and confusion deepened into something approaching disbelief. The plates held real food, not watery porridge or stale bread, but substantial portions of scrambled eggs still steaming, strips of crispy bacon, slices of toasted bread with actual butter melting into golden pools. Fresh milk in metal cups rather than the weak ersatz coffee that had been their morning standard. The aroma alone triggered responses deeper than conscious thought, the smell of normalcy, of plenty, of a world where breakfast could be more than mere survival fuel. For a long moment, silence gripped the hall. 47 women stared at their plates with expressions ranging from bewilderment to something approaching anguish. No one lifted a fork. Years of rationing in wartime Germany, followed by the desperate starvation of retreat and captivity, had conditioned reflexes that simple abundance now violated. This much food, this quality of food seemed impossible, unreal, perhaps poisoned or part of some cruel experiment. Sergeant Vaughn recognized the paralysis and understood its source. She picked up her own breakfast tray and sat at one of the prisoner tables, a violation of protocol that drew sharp looks from the supervising guards. Without ceremony, she began eating, demonstrating through action what words could not convey. This food was genuine, safe, and theirs to consume. The first woman to break was not Marguerite Hoffman, whose education and composure had made her the unofficial leader, nor Frieda Schaefer, whose hardened cynicism seemed impenetrable. It was Anneliese Bauer, a 19-year-old from a small Bavarian village who had been conscripted into auxiliary service only 7 months earlier. She picked up a strip of bacon, held it to her nose, inhaled deeply, and began to weep. The tears came silently, at first just moisture tracking down hollowed cheeks, but then her shoulders began to shake. The bacon fell from her trembling fingers back onto her plate. "Mein Gott," she whispered. "Mein Gott." The words emerged not as prayer but as involuntary recognition of something fundamental. This was real food, freely given, without cruelty or condition. After months of increasingly desperate rations, after eating grass soup and potato peels, after watching stronger women wither from starvation during the retreat, this simple breakfast demolished every defensive barrier she had constructed. Anneliese's breakdown triggered a cascade. Beside her, Greta Zimmermann, a 27-year-old radio operator from Dresden, put her face in her hands and sobbed with the raw abandon of someone who had forgotten crying was possible. Across the table, Helga Werner, who had maintained stoic silence since capture, made a sound somewhere between laugh and wail before burying her face in her arms. Within moments, nearly half the women in the mess hall were crying, some quietly, some with body-racking intensity while their breakfast grew cold before them. The American personnel present reacted with visible discomfort. The armed guards shifted uneasily, uncertain whether this represented some form of breakdown requiring intervention. The kitchen staff, visible through the serving window, stood frozen in confusion. Only Sergeant Dorothy Vaughn seemed to understand what was unfolding. She remained seated at the prisoner table, her own breakfast forgotten, and simply waited as the emotional storm ran its course. Marguerite Hoffman fought against her own tears with the iron discipline that had carried her through 2 years of war. She stared at her plate, at the yellow eggs and brown bacon and white toast colors so vivid they seemed painted, unreal, belonging to some remembered world from before everything changed. She thought of her mother, who would have considered this breakfast modest. Nothing special, just an ordinary Sunday meal from before the war. That thought of ordinariness, of the simple expectation of sufficiency finally broke through her defenses. The tears came hot and unexpected, carrying with them not just hunger satisfied but a crushing recognition of loss. Loss of home, of certainty, of the future she had imagined, of the lies she had believed, of years that could never be reclaimed. She wept for her husband's unknown fate, for her mother incinerated in Hamburg's firestorm, for her own complicity in a system whose evil she had willfully ignored. The bacon and eggs were not just food. They were evidence of the vast gulf between propaganda and reality, between what she had been told about the enemy and what she now experienced. According to a report filed by Lieutenant Colonel Henderson to his superiors, later archived in the National Archives and Records Administration, the incident at breakfast lasted approximately 15 minutes before the emotional intensity began to subside. Henderson, observing from his office, chose not to intervene, recognizing instinctively that something profoundly human was occurring. Something the military protocol could neither address nor contain. Gradually the crying diminished to sniffles and shuddering breaths. Women wiped their faces with rough napkins, avoided each other's eyes, and confronted the cooling food before them. Frida Schaefer was the first to actually eat, lifting her fork with hands that still trembled slightly and taking a deliberate bite of scrambled eggs. The act seemed almost defiant in acceptance of reality over ideology. By late morning, word of the breakfast incident had spread throughout Camp Fannon's administrative staff, generating reactions that ranged from bewilderment to unexpected compassion. In the officers' club, over coffee and cigarettes, junior officers debated what the crying meant. Captain Walsh, Henderson's administrative officer, suggested it was simple hunger satisfied after prolonged deprivation. A chaplain, Captain Thomas Miller, offered a different interpretation. Sometimes kindness is harder to bear than cruelty. It forces you to confront what you've lost. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson requested and received permission to deviate from standard POW meal protocols for the female prisoners. Going forward, they would receive the same quality meals as the male German posts, which meant substantially better food than the minimal rations initially allocated. This decision aligned with Geneva Convention requirements but exceeded the strictly interpreted minimum standards. Henderson justified it in practical terms. Healthier prisoners required less medical attention and could contribute more labor, but his private motivations ran deeper. In the women's barracks that afternoon, an unusual conversation unfolded. Marguerite Hoffman, having regained her composure, found herself surrounded by fellow prisoners seeking to make sense of their morning's breakdown. They spoke in low voices, aware that walls had ears and that expressing certain thoughts could be dangerous even in captivity. Yet the shared emotional experience had created a temporary space for honesty. "I could not remember the last time I saw such food," admitted Greta Zimmerman, the radio operator from Dresden. "Perhaps Christmas 1942? My mother somehow acquired 2 eggs for the family 6 of us sharing 2 eggs. We thought it feast." Helga Werner, who had operated telecommunications equipment from a bunker near Königsberg until the Soviet advance forced evacuation, spoke with quiet intensity. "The bacon, the smell, it reminded me of my father's butcher shop before the war. Real meat, not the sawdust they mixed into sausage from 1943 onward." I had forgotten food could actually smell like food. The conversation turned inevitably to implications. If the Americans fed their prisoners well, and these women had observed similar treatment of the male German posts through the wire fences separating compounds, what did that say about the propaganda they had absorbed? Frida Schaefer, whose cynicism had been armor against hope, voiced what others feared to admit. Everything we were told was lies. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. But monsters do not waste bacon and eggs on enemy prisoners while their own children receive ration books. This recognition carried devastating weight. Accepting that American propaganda had exaggerated or falsified enemy behavior was one thing all sides engaged in such tactics. But acknowledging that the fundamental moral framework they had accepted, the justifications for total war and total mobilization, might be inverted, that calculation threatened the foundations of identity itself. Marguerite struggled with this realization throughout the afternoon. Her education gave her analytical tools that proved, in this moment, more burden than blessing. She recognized the cognitive dissonance and understood its implications. If the Americans were not monsters, then by extension, the cause she had served might not be righteous. And if the cause was not righteous, what did that make her? Not a patriot defending her homeland, but something far more troubling, a willing participant in crimes she had preferred not to see. The evening meal brought none of the drama of breakfast. The women ate their standard rations, still substantially better than what they had received during the war's final months with subdued attention, but something fundamental had shifted. The defensive suspicion that had characterized their first days in captivity began eroding, replaced by cautious acceptance that these particular Americans at least intended no harm beyond the necessary constraints of imprisonment. Sergeant Dorothy Vaughan observed these changes with professional interest and personal compassion. In her daily report to Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, she noted, "Psychological barrier has been crossed. Prisoners beginning to accept that humane treatment is genuine rather than manipulation. Recommend continuing current approach to facilitate adjustment and future repatriation preparation." April 8, 1945, 1 week after the Easter breakfast, the female prisoners had settled into a routine that bore increasing resemblance to institutional life rather than wartime captivity. The work assignments continued: laundry, mending, and basic maintenance tasks that kept them occupied without being exploitative. But the quality of their quarters had improved through small adjustments, additional blankets acquired, broken windows repaired, a weekly shower schedule established that used the base's proper facilities rather than makeshift arrangements. The male German posts, housed in separate compounds but visible during exercise periods and work details, had noticed the presence of female prisoners with intense interest. Camp regulations strictly prohibited fraternization between the compounds, but communication proved impossible to completely prevent. Notes passed through laundry bundles. Brief conversations during supervised work periods when both groups operated in proximity. Even shouted exchanges across wire fences despite prohibitions. The human need for connection found channels. These interactions revealed something unexpected. The male posts, many of whom had been in American captivity for over a year, had undergone their own psychological transformations. Captured during the North African campaign or following the Normandy invasion, they had experienced sufficient time to process defeat and adjust to imprisonment. They viewed the newly arrived women with mixture of curiosity and paternal concern, but also with pragmatic realism about Germany's fate that the women found both reassuring and disturbing. Through these illicit conversations, Marguerite learned that Germany's military situation had progressed from desperate to terminal. The male prisoners received occasional letters from home heavily censored, but sufficient to confirm what American newspapers reported. Soviet forces occupied Berlin, the Western Allies crossed the Rhine, the Reich contracted daily toward ultimate dissolution. This information, filtered through fellow Germans rather than enemy sources, carried credibility that official announcements lacked. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson faced unexpected pressure from other sectors of the camp regarding the female prisoners. Some of the American enlisted personnel, particularly those with wives or sisters back home, had developed protective attitudes toward the German women that complicated the necessary distance between captor and captive. Henderson addressed this in a staff meeting, reminding personnel that compassion was appropriate but familiarity was not. These women are enemy combatants being held under Geneva Convention provisions. Treat them humanely, but never forget they served the Nazi war machine willingly. Yet Henderson himself struggled with the complexities his stern directive implied. In his private correspondence with his wife, Martha, back in Oklahoma, he wrote, "The women here present dilemmas I never anticipated. They are educated, articulate, and as far as I can determine, were never party members or ideological fanatics, just ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. How do we reconcile punishment with compassion? Justice with mercy? I find myself wishing these decisions belonged to someone with more wisdom than a farm boy from Tulsa who happened to become a lieutenant colonel." The transformation within the female prisoners' compound became evident in unexpected ways. Women who had maintained sullen silence began participating in limited English lessons that Sergeant Vaughn organized. They asked questions about America tentative at first, then with growing boldness. Was Texas representative of the entire country? How did American women manage homes and children during wartime? Was the food they received as prisoners actually typical of American standards? Each question represented a crack in the propaganda edifice they had inhabited. Frieda Schaefer, the Berlin widow whose cynicism had seemed impenetrable, underwent perhaps the most visible transformation. She began organizing informal German language classes for the younger American WAC personnel, an activity approved by Henderson as beneficial for both parties. Through teaching her native language, Frieda found purpose that transcended her prisoner status. She also discovered that American women were neither the degenerate creatures Nazi propaganda had portrayed nor the vengeful Amazons she had feared, but rather ordinary people performing their duties with varying degrees of enthusiasm and competence, human, in other words, just like herself. April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's 56th and final birthday. Though the women in Camp Fannin could not have known it would be his last, brought an unexpected development that would test the psychological progress they had made. The Red Cross delivered the first mail from Germany since their capture, a batch of letters that had been delayed for weeks during processing and censorship review. 23 of the 47 women received mail. 24 did not. The letters themselves were artifacts of catastrophe, written on scraps of paper, often in pencil that had faded nearly to illegibility. They brought news that ranged from heartbreaking to devastating. Marguerite Hoffmann received a letter from a neighbor in Hamburg, dated February 19, 45, informing her that her mother's body had been recovered from the rubble of their apartment building following a raid in mid-January. The neighbor apologized for the delay in writing, but explained that mail service had become irregular as the Reich collapsed, a euphemism that barely masked the disintegration of all civil infrastructure. Marguerite read the letter 3 times, sitting on her bunk while afternoon light slanted through the barracks windows. Her mother, Keith Hoffmann, had been 61 years old, a schoolteacher who had taught children their letters for 35 years before retirement. She had survived the catastrophic firestorm bombings of 1943 only to die in the war's final months, crushed by falling masonry when her building took a direct hit. The letter concluded with the neighbor's postscript, "Your mother spoke often of you. She kept your photograph beside her bed until the end. She was proud of you, Marguerite, even when she questioned the war itself." That final sentence contained depths of meaning that Marguerite found almost unbearable. Her mother had questioned the war, had seen through the propaganda, recognized the madness, perhaps even understood the moral bankruptcy of the regime, but had loved her daughter anyway, despite Marguerite's service to that regime. The convergence of loss and implicit forgiveness proved more painful than either would have been separately. Greta Zimmermann's letter brought different but equally devastating news. Her husband, an infantry officer, had been killed during the Soviet offensive into East Prussia in late January. The letter came from his commanding officer, written in the formal, stilted language of official condolence, but including a personal addition, "Your husband died bravely," covering the retreat of his men. In these final days, such actions define who we remain despite everything else we have become. The women who received no letters faced their own particular agony. Not knowing was worse than knowing. Was no news good news, or did it mean that everyone they loved was dead, displaced, or unable to communicate? The silence suggested erasure, the possibility that the world they had known no longer existed in any recognizable form. That evening, the barracks atmosphere was thick with grief. Some women wept openly. Others retreated into numb silence. Frieda Schaefer, who received a letter from her sister confirming that their childhood home in Berlin no longer existed, the entire neighborhood now. Rubble surprised everyone by organizing an impromptu memorial service. Speaking in German, with Sergeant Vaughn's permission, she led a simple ceremony acknowledging their losses and honoring the dead. It was not political no speeches about the Reich or the Führer, just an ancient human ritual of remembering those who were gone. Sergeant Vaughn attended the ceremony, standing respectfully at the back of the barracks. Afterward, she filed a report noting that the arrival of mail from Germany had precipitated significant emotional distress, but also appears to have accelerated prisoners' acceptance of Germany's defeat and current reality. Recommend continued monitored mail delivery as therapeutic despite short-term psychological impact. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson read Vaughn's report and made a decision that exceeded his strict authority. He requested permission from higher command to allow the female prisoners to write reply letters, subject to censorship that would be sent through Red Cross channels. The request was approved within 48 hours. Someone up the chain of command understood that maintaining human connections, even for enemy prisoners, served purposes beyond mere humanitarianism. May 8, 1945 Victory in Europe Day arrived at Camp Fannin, not with celebration in the female prisoners' compound, but with stunned, complicated silence. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed after 12 years of existence, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a moral catastrophe that would take generations to fully comprehend. The American personnel celebrated with restraint, conscious of the defeated enemy in their midst. In the officers' club, Lieutenant Colonel Henderson raised a glass of bourbon and offered a toast to the boys who brought us this far, and to those who won't make it home. The celebration felt incomplete with the Pacific War still raging, but Henderson recognized the significance of this particular ending. The Nazi regime, its evil now fully exposed through the liberation of concentration camps, had been destroyed. That achievement justified the sacrifices, even as it raised uncomfortable questions about what came next for the millions of Germans who had served, supported, or simply endured that regime. In the female prisoners' compound, Marguerite Hoffman sat on her bunk and tried to process what unconditional surrender meant for her personal future. Repatriation would eventually occur, but to what? The letters from Germany painted pictures of devastation beyond comprehension. Hamburg was rubble. Dresden had been incinerated. Berlin was a battlefield. The entire infrastructure of German civil society had been pulverized. Where would she go? Who would she become in whatever emerged from the ruins? The question of complicity weighed heavily. The full horror of the Nazi regime's crimes had become undeniable through the American camp newspapers that now circulated in the prisoners' compound. Photographs from liberated concentration camps, testimonies from survivors, evidence of systematic mass murder that exceeded propaganda exaggeration or fevered imagination. These revelations forced confrontation with terrible questions. How had they not known? How had they convinced themselves the rumors were enemy lies? What did it mean to have served, even in auxiliary roles, a regime capable of such evil? Frieda Schaefer wrestled with these questions more publicly than most. During an evening discussion, she spoke with raw honesty. I told myself I was just doing communications work, just helping the army function. I was not political, I was not a party member, I was just surviving and serving my country. But the army I helped function built those camps. The orders I had transmitted enabled those crimes. How do I live with that knowledge? No one had answers, but the willingness to ask the questions marked transformation. These women had entered Camp Fannin as defeated combatants still clinging to remnants of national identity and defensive pride. The simple breakfast of bacon and eggs had begun cracking that defensive shell, revealing the frightened, grieving, morally compromised human beings beneath. The subsequent weeks had accelerated that process through humanizing interactions with their captors, through devastating news from home, and through forced confrontation with their regime's crimes. Sergeant Dorothy Vaughan observed these transformations with professional satisfaction and personal ambivalence. In her final report before rotation back to the States, dated June 1, 1945, she wrote, "The German female posts at Camp Fannin have undergone significant psychological evolution during their captivity. Initial defensive hostility has given way to acceptance of defeat and beginning stages of moral reckoning with Nazi Germany's crimes. The Easter breakfast incident, while seemingly minor, appears to have been the catalyst for this transformation, demonstrating through simple human kindness that Allied propaganda was closer to truth than Nazi propaganda. These women will return to Germany carrying with them evidence that the American enemy was more humane than their own government. Whether this lesson influences Germany's reconstruction remains to be seen. By summer's end, repatriation processes began. The women would return to Germany in phases, released to occupation zones to rebuild their shattered country and their shattered lives. Marguerite Hoffman, standing in line for transport back to Bremerhaven, carried with her the leather satchel she had clutched upon arrival, still containing the photograph and prayer book, now joined by letters from home, a few personal items accumulated during captivity, and something intangible but profound. Knowledge that the enemy had fed her bacon and eggs on Easter Sunday, that kindness existed even in war, and that the lies she had believed were inversions of truth. The breakfast that had made them weep had been no propaganda stunt, no calculated manipulation. It had been, impossibly, exactly what it appeared, a simple gesture of human decency that bridged the vast chasm of war and enemy status. Sometimes, in the wreckage of terrible things, the smallest acts of goodness carried the most weight, precisely because they testified to something that transcended politics and nations and ideology, the stubborn persistence of basic humanity even when everything conspired to extinguish it. That lesson, learned over bacon and eggs in a Texas POW camp, would follow these women through the difficult decades of rebuilding that lay ahead.